Hello, everyone. Welcome back to PA 605, Organizational Behavior in Government Agencies. This is the second part of the presentation for week 4. Last time we looked at information from Radin's book, The Accountable Juggler, and talked about how accountability and different perspectives on accountability related to our H5N1 scenario, and also talked about Maslow's hierarchy of needs and how those ideas related to managing during a crisis scenario. Now we're going to pick up with part 2, talking about resilience and some different perspectives on resilience. So the readings address both individual resilience and community resilience. And Kendra provides some different definitions or different perspectives. So one theory of resilience is that it's a combination of competence, belonging, usefulness, potency, and optimism. So someone can exhibit resilience in a crisis situation if they feel like they have the competence to do what they need to do during an emergency, whether it's actually responding directly to that emergency or just being able to continue to do their regular work during that situation. Belonging, if you have good relationships with your family, friends, coworkers, if you're connected within your community, that gives people resilience. If people have a purpose, uh, that helps to sustain them during an emergency, a sense of mission. So, going back to Goodsell, if you're working in an organization and that organization has a strong sense of mission, that will hopefully help people to perform well in a crisis. If people feel like they have the potency or capacity to really make a difference, to really have an effect on their situation and their environment, and optimism. If people have hope that things will improve, that they'll be able to get out of the situation safely and things will eventually return to normal, that also factors into resilience. So there's a metaphor for resilience that's offered in the reading, which is an antibody that enables people to ward off attackers that might stop even the most formidable among us. So they look at H5N1 obviously is an actual virus, but they're sort of using a virus as a metaphor for a lot of different types of emergencies, be they natural hazards or what have you. And in this metaphor, they're arguing that resilience is like an antibody that will fight off the infection of a crisis and allow people to get back to normal functioning. So, another definition that's offered in the reading is a set of attributes that provides people with the strength and fortitude to confront the overwhelming obstacles they're bound to face in life. So looking at resilience, not just from the perspective of like a major crisis situation or a serious emergency situation, but just resilience in the face of sort of day-to-day challenges, whether they're economic challenges or health challenges or challenges at work, the kinds of situations that we tend to face on a daily basis. Um, Resilience is also defined as the process of and capacity for or outcome of successful adaptation despite challenging or threatening circumstances. So the idea of being able to adapt to new circumstances and to be able to prevail even though you find yourself in an unexpected situation. And again, it could be a crisis situation like a infectious disease outbreak like COVID-19 or H5N1, or it could be a natural hazard, or it could be losing a job or a more kind of individualized event that really challenges people, and people's ability to adapt to those situations is a measure of resilience according to this perspective. So Obviously, individual resilience would be important in the H5N1 scenario, particularly, now that the scenario has sort of transitioned to the idea that there's more person-to-person spread. We're potentially in a situation where it's more like the COVID-19 pandemic, and there's the more potential for people to become seriously ill, and uh, staffs might become stretched thinner because more people are having to take off work, and people are going to be more afraid. There's just going to be more stress in general. Um, so that the individual resilience that people are able to muster is going to affect the degree to which a lot of organizations will continue to function, because if you have a lot of people who are not able to function during an emergency, obviously that's going to hurt the performance of organizations, and that's going to have ripple effects throughout society. So, kind of going back to what we were talking about before in terms of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, talking about sort of the foundational idea of physiological security. If we're dealing with an infectious disease outbreak that could potentially make us very sick, obviously that threatens that foundational level. So we need to feel physically safe before we can really perform at any of those other levels. And in terms of accountability, uh, organizations obviously are going to be held accountable for their level of performance. So if government agencies and nonprofit organizations are failing because their people are not able to show up for work, or are choosing not to show up for work, whatever the case might be, obviously organizations are going to be judged. If it's an infectious disease outbreak and hospitals are not able to admit patients because they don't have enough staff, uh, because of, in part because of lack of adequate resilience and lack of adequate preparation, that's going to have a negative effect on that organization. And that negative impact could have ripple effects beyond the emergency, because they could keep that sort of reputation of not being able to perform well in a crisis on into the future. So that sort of leads into the idea of organizational resilience, which is differentiated from individual resilience, although certainly they're connected, because if you've got a lot of issues with people who have a lack of individual resilience, that's going to weaken the overall organization. But they mention the idea of high reliability organizations. And This is the idea that um, resilience was a component of reliability. So we were just talking about, hospitals in an infectious disease scenario, and we anticipate when we get sick or have a serious injury or something like that, we can go to the hospital and get treatment. And that's because we have a sense that, hospitals are reliable places to get certain types of services. So in an emergency like COVID-19 or H5N1 or anything like that, um, the level of reliability is going to be based in part on the level of resilience, which involves, norms of communication, improvisation, and shifts of decision-making power, according to the reading, to people who are close to the action. So there needs to be communication throughout the organization, from the highest level to the people on the front lines. There needs to be improvisation, and that kind of gets back to that idea of adaptability. You need to be able to uh, change your perspective and change the way you approach situations based on changes in circumstances, whether that's a change in the number of staff or a change in the equipment that is available. During COVID-19, you had situations in hospitals where people were running short on personal protective equipment, so they were using garbage bags and other sort of makeshift things to stand in for hospital gowns and other types of personal protective equipment. And the idea of shifting decision making power to people who are close to the action That's the idea, going back to the idea of decentralization, which we talked about in the accountability discussion. The idea that sometimes in crisis situations, the people at the very top of the organization are not in the best place to make important decisions regarding how to respond to certain situations because they're not on the ground and they're not seeing everything and they don't have all of the information. So sometimes it is appropriate to shift control to uh, the people who are on the front lines and make them, what might be called battlefield decisions, people making decisions in the moment. And that kind of gets back to that idea of bureaucratic discretion. Sometimes people at the higher levels of organizations have to trust people on the front lines to make judgment calls because it's just not feasible to wait for directives from the top of the chain. So, in this idea, resilience in an organization was part of the capacity to manage risk. So, in order to be able to stand up in the face of different types of threats, organizations need to develop adequate levels of resilience. And the reading goes on to talk about Weich's four attributes, which again are improvisation. So, again, that ability to adapt to new situations and to be able to come up with new approaches to situations that maybe you haven't used before. Virtual role systems, which is basically the idea that people should be adequately cross trained and people should be able to fill in different positions within an organization. That if, you know, take for example, again, a hospital, if a doctor or a nurse or a physician's assistant or what have you, if there's a lack of certain, personnel that perform certain tasks, that you can step in and perform those tasks. Or if you're trying to analyze a situation, you can kind of put yourself in the role of different types of individuals and kind of figure out how the situation could be resolved. So not being so wedded to one position within the organization that you can't see how other things should be done or perform other types of roles. Wisdom, understanding, you know, uh, what it is that you don't know is part of wisdom. So looking at a situation and making judgments based on the information at hand, but then understanding that there's certain information that you might not have privy to, so you might have to seek out that information in order to make a full plan in order to figure out how to deal with the circumstance. So wisdom is often said to come from experience. So presumably you have people in the organization who have been in emergency situations before and can kind of take those experiences and adapt them to the current circumstances, but then also recognize that they don't have all the answers and that they need to maybe seek out some additional information. And having respectful interaction between people. So even in crisis situations where stress is high and people's emotions may be amped up, maintaining respectful relationships within the organization, between coworkers in the organization, and then obviously between people in the organization and the people who are being served. So again, using the hospital situation, you've got to be having respectful interactions between the doctors, nurses, and other medical professionals, but also keeping things respectful between the medical professionals and the patients and other responders that might be coming into the hospital. Because if things devolve into anger and sniping and things like that, it's going to be very counterproductive for everyone. continuing with the discussion of organizational resilience and individual resilience. Um, some of the individual characteristics that are said to contribute to resilience include perceiving experiences constructively and performing positive adaptive behaviors. So, being able to look at a situation and being able to see, potentially the positives that could come from that situation, or the positive outcomes in terms of being able to, again, using the hospital as an example, um, you know looking at it as an opportunity to learn how to serve patients better under difficult circumstances, um, maybe develop some new techniques and approaches that could be used in the hospital moving forward. So, trying to put some kind of a positive spin on the situation. Um, if you're in a situation, again, like the COVID-19 pandemic or the H5N1, if it turns into something where it's being transmitted from person to person, it's easy to get stressed out and to see it as just a daily slog and a struggle. And it is, and people are going to struggle and people are going to feel stressed, but trying to take something positive from that. And one thing people took positive from COVID-19, and presumably they'll take it from future emergencies as well, is the development of camaraderie and stronger relationships. You saw that kind of in the Neil reading about the professional learning communities and the teachers coming together to help each other during COVID-19, and developing those kinds of relationships that hopefully will translate into future collaborations down the road. And then performing positive adaptive behaviors. So, being able to develop good adaptive behaviors in our regular lives so that when things happen and disrupt our lives, even more, like a serious emergency, an infectious disease emergency or something like that, we're in a better position to respond positively to that. So it's easy to we get into our routines, and it's really easy to, whenever anything goes wrong, we have car trouble, or, um, there's a long line at the checkout at the grocery store, or we miss an appointment or something like that. It's really easy to kind of let those things negatively affect us, worldview and our attitude and all those kinds of things. So developing sort of good adaptive behaviors where we are in a position where we can respond to those things positively. And if we develop those kinds of capabilities to see the best in different situations and to not let those completely throw us off, we'll be in a much better position to respond to bigger emergencies down the road. And I think a lot of people did develop that, during COVID-19, where, a lot of us were, forced to stay at home, and we weren't able to go to our regular restaurants that we like to eat, and we weren't able to go to church. And, a lot of things were disrupted. Kids weren't able to go to school. So in order to kind of survive that situation, I think most of us had to engage in those kinds of positive adaptive behaviors, and also, look at those experiences constructively. So think about, how could this help to make our family closer? Or how could I use this as an opportunity to get closer to my friends by communicating more, through Facebook and Zoom and things like that. It also talks about in the Kindra reading, organizational norms facilitate individual action. So the idea of goal-directed solution seeking. So that kind of harkens back in my mind to Goodsell. In terms of goal, you could substitute the term goal with mission. and you're trying to find solutions to continue to achieve your mission, even though the circumstances are very difficult. So you're always looking to uh, not only survive during these situations, but find ways to continue to move the organization forward. Multiple source reliance. Um, so you want the organization to not be too dependent on any one source for essential goods or essential services. Um, so again, when it comes, and this is one of the things that became apparent during COVID-19, like with personal protective equipment and hospitals, when you have key resources that you're going to need during an emergency, you don't want to be completely dependent on one source for that material, because there's a high probability that either that source will be running out, or in some cases during COVID-19, there were businesses that were breaking their contracts and sort of selling to the highest bidder. So you want to have redundancies built into the system where if there's essential things that you're going to need, there's a fallback you can go to if your original source doesn't perform. And then that gets into, again, resource access. People to get their jobs done need resources. And that could be material resources, but that can also be information. People need access to good information during emergencies. So if you're in the public health sector, you need information about how serious a threat is in your community. Um, if you're working in other public service areas during an emergency like this, you're still going to need an understanding of what trends are going on in the community. How severe is the infection rate? Um, you know, because that's going to dictate. Say you're looking at like children's services, you know, if the infection rate is increasing, that increases the probability that children are going to be out of school. And if that probability that children are going to be out of school increases, that potentially puts more children at risk. So you need to have that kind of information on hand to sort of know, you need to step up home visits, you need to step up your own surveillance practices to account for that. Kendra lays out some elements of resilience, some of which we've touched upon already. We've talked about improvisation, being able to adapt to new situations and come up with new ways of solving problems. Natural resources, just in terms of communities and organizations at large, all the way down to the individual level. You're obviously going to need access to natural resources in order to continue to engage in regular manufacturing, and obviously water is going to be essential for a variety of reasons. So if any of that is being threatened, that's a major issue for resilience. Physical infrastructure resources, so being able to maintain your utilities, your electrical, your water, making sure your power stations have adequate personnel and adequate equipment. Roads are continuing to be maintained. Railroads are operating effectively, because if you start to have crumbling infrastructure, the ability to get necessary goods and services to people is going to be severely hampered, and loss of power and water obviously has a lot of negative implications. You want to have both institutional and community capital. So you need to have capital within your institutions, your hospitals, your schools, your government offices, all those things that people are going to depend on in an emergency. And within the wider community, you need to have community capital. So you need to have nonprofit organizations, faith-based organizations, different types of groups that can contribute strength in the event of an emergency. Political capital, again, you want to have a well-functioning government in any type of emergency. And political capital in terms of a well-functioning government, but also political capital in terms of people having some connection or some relationship with the government. You want that to be a bi-directional relationship that is in good condition. People, having human capital, so having people who are healthy, both physically and emotionally, people who have those characteristics of, being able to look at situations constructively, adapt to changing circumstances. So if you have a lot of people in your community who are, have health issues, have emotional issues, things like that, you need to look at ways that you can improve those conditions prior to a disaster or an emergency, because those are definitely going to become severe issues. And we saw that, during COVID-19, if there were people who already were suffering from depression and mental illness and things like that, or drug abuse, those problems became worse during COVID in a lot of situations. Economic capital, obviously, the stronger the economy is of a community going into a disaster like a COVID-19 or H5N1 kind of situation, the better they're going to be able to weather the storm. If businesses have capital saved up, if people have capital saved up that they can live on. If the government is in a good financial situation, that's going to make a big difference in terms of the community being able to bounce back, as opposed to having a lot of businesses closing down after the emergency has passed. And then social capital kind of relates to a lot of these things, but again, it's the idea of as individuals, our relationships with our family, our friends, our coworkers, being a part of different organizations, civic organizations, religious organizations, political organizations, whatever the case is. But having people in the community who have connections and organizations within the community that have connections. Because if there's not a lot of connectedness in the community going into an emergency, it's hard to build those bridges during the emergency. So the Gill and Ritchie readings looks at some particular examples of some emergencies that have happened in the past. And 3 Mile Island was a situation back in, I want to say 1979, I believe, where a nuclear reactor in the United States, I believe it was the state of Connecticut, experienced a near meltdown situation. And this was before, the Chernobyl incident where they had an actual meltdown. So, Gill and Ritchie look at that and they try to draw some lessons from that. And they refer to the book Normal Accidents by Pero, which came out in 1984, which actually, again, preceded the Chernobyl situation. But Pero's takeaway from 3 Mile Island and other kinds of similar incidents was that tightly coupled technological and organizational systems are bound to fail. So when you have complex technology and keeping that complex technology operational depends on well-functioning organizational systems. So there's a lot of codependency going on there. The technology depends on the organizational structures, and the organizational structures depend on the technology. In Pero's view, those types of organizations are bound to fail. error-inducing systems, according to the reading, can be improved to reduce probabilities of failure, but there's always potential for design flaws, failure of parts and procedures, operator errors, and unanticipated conditions. So, you can look at any situation where there was a major catastrophe that involved technology failure. I was recently reading a book about Chernobyl, and that really applies to that situation, where there were both failures of equipment at Chernobyl, but there were also errors in operation, people doing things that they shouldn't have done, and unanticipated conditions can come into play as well. I was also recently reading a book about the Challenger explosion back in 1986, the space shuttle that exploded at liftoff and killed the astronauts on board. And one of the situations there was that they were doing the launch in Florida, and cold usually isn't a big issue in Florida, but for whatever reason, there was a really sharp cold spell right around the time in January that they were going to do that launch. And that cold negatively affected equipment on the shuttle. So as a result of the effects of the cold, as well as some of the equipment being flawed, the design being flawed, the shuttle exploded. So you had a real combination of all of these things. You had a design flaw in terms of the rocket boosters, which resulted in a failure of the parts. And there was also a failure of procedures because they went through a review process to decide whether or not they should launch, and decided to launch even though they were aware that this could be a danger. Operator errors. There weren't really any operator errors on the part of the astronauts because nothing they did, as far as we know, contributed to the problem. But there were operator errors in terms of the people who were monitoring the equipment and people who were choosing to launch, even though it wasn't safe to do so based on the information that they had. So that's a good example of an error-inducing system. So if you read anything about, and there's a good book, I'm still finishing it, called Challenger by Adam Higginbotham, and that's a good book. But there's a Netflix documentary series that talks about it. There's a lot of good sources out there if you want to learn more about that. So another lesson is that systems resist regulation, provide inadequate warnings, and lack public preparedness. And that was true in the case of 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl, where there's inadequate regulation. The situations emerged in a way that provided inadequate warning, and even when it was clear that there were dangers from radiation, the company who was managing the plant and the government didn't really adequately warn the public about what was going on, and there wasn't adequate preparedness. There weren't adequate plans in place for how do we evacuate people and things like that. So it's noted that disasters are embedded in social processes rather than merely onset. So disasters don't just occur because of hurricanes or because of wildfires or because of nuclear plants malfunctioning, but disasters occur because those events happen and we haven't prepared adequately socially to deal with them. We don't have the resilience in place, we don't have the preparedness in place to deal with them. So the point that I think Gil and Richie are trying to make is that we sort of, in the way that we sort of operate on a day-to-day basis in society, we sort of sow the seeds for these disasters. So when these events occur, we're not prepared to adequately respond to them. So I mentioned Chernobyl. Chernobyl was talked about as an exemplar of how risks in the modern era transcended space and time as well as social class. Um, so, Chernobyl, a situation like that where a massive amount of radiation was released, that radiation spread around the globe and continues to have effects today, even though it took place in 1986. And it's something that, regardless of how wealthy you are or anything like that, when a major radiation event like that occurs on a global scale, that's going to affect you. And the same is true. There was Fukushima in Japan, another nuclear incident back in 2011, similar kind of situation. Um, so it talks about ontological security, the confidence that most human beings have in the self-identity and in the constancy of the surrounding social and material environments of action. So, we have this sort of day-to-day belief that things are going to stay relatively stable, that I'm going to be the same person doing the same thing tomorrow as I am today, that the sort of social environment and material environment is going to stay the same. I'm going to continue to go to work the same place. I'm going to continue to live in the same house. All of those kinds of things. And Chernobyl challenges that because obviously the people who lived in the area around Chernobyl had to evacuate and weren't able to return to their homes because of the severe radioactivity. So it severely changed their identity, their social environment, their material environment. So it's similar. You could say similar things for the wildfires in California, even though a lot of people in the long term probably will try to rebuild. There's going to be some people who aren't going to be able to rebuild and are going to have to completely kind of change their lives as a result of that. Technological hazards and risks of late modernity lead to doubts about the safety of the air we breathe, the water we drink, food we consume, dwellings that we live and work in, and existing social structures. So again, the idea that because of failures like nuclear power plants, it could have environmental consequences that render unsafe many things that we depend on. And you can look at, similarly, you could look at computer systems and the risk that if, a major hacking event were to take place and affected electric utilities and water utilities and a lot of different systems, that would also have, drastic negative consequences moving forward. So, we have to be aware of those technological hazards and try to take adequate preparations. And I think that's something that we're continuing to struggle with, is really coming to terms with the risk of a major hacking event from a hostile force creating societal disruption. So Piku 2009 talks about vulnerability as a multifarious combination of place-based, social, and political factors. So where we live, geographically, the type of society that we live in, and the type of political situation that we're in affects our level of vulnerability. So the geographic issues we can't really exert control over. People in Florida, because of geography, are going to be prone to hurricanes. People in California, because of their location, are going to be prone to wildfires. So there's a certain amount of that we can control. But socially, we can take steps to mitigate those things, and politically, we can take steps to mitigate those things. Or potentially, if we make the wrong choices, we can make things worse. People living precariously due to social and political environments were more adversely affected because of these factors. So obviously, if you're at a low socioeconomic status, you're more at risk. And if you have a political environment that is dysfunctional, where branches of government, the executive and the legislature, aren't able to work together very well. That amps up the level of risk as well. The social capital upon which they relied on a day-to-day basis in some cases inhibited evacuation responses, leading to ability. In other cases, social capital enabled local response efforts. So again, going back to the idea of social connectedness, individual connectedness, organizational connectedness. So this is talking about examples where if people did need to evacuate, like in a wildfire kind of situation, if there's a high level of social capital, it's easier to be able to perform those kinds of tasks. However, if you've got weaker social capital, it's going to be more difficult. And we saw that like with Hurricane Katrina, where people were told to evacuate before the hurricane in 2005, but because they had a low level of social capital, they weren't able to evacuate and ended up, at great risk. And some of them ended up sick and dying as a result of that. But if you've got stronger levels of social capital, then you can mount a stronger response. So short and long-term relocation also increased vulnerabilities by reducing access to networks and social capital that had been crucial for survival in New Orleans long before Katrina. So again, going back to that Hurricane Katrina example, those who were able to stay or return to New Orleans faced additional vulnerabilities through toxic exposure. So basically, if you are in a situation where you're forced to evacuate and forced to relocate, that in and of itself creates vulnerabilities. Because if you're taken out of your community, you're taken away potentially from your family and friends and things you typically depend on for support. So the idea of building up individual resilience where you can adapt better to those types of situations is important. But also having, the larger community, the federal government, state governments, building up larger networks of support systems to be able to support people over long distances in those situations. And obviously, recognizing that people may be returning home to a lot of challenges. They may have flooded homes. Those homes may have been exposed to toxic chemicals or things like that. So being able to, take adequate mitigation measures to sort of address those issues moving forward. Stress and social disruption could be more long-term for such groups. So obviously, for the people who have experienced the wildfires in California, there's going to be a long road ahead in terms of stress, in terms of having a place to live when your home has been lost. If your community has been destroyed, kind of rebuilding that social network. And the same is true for people who experience hurricanes and tornadoes and all sorts of emergencies that cause a lot of destruction. So this is a graph for a graphic from the Kubrick reading, and it's a little smaller than I anticipated. I'm going to see if I can zoom in on this. Okay, it's about as good as. But obviously, you can look at this in your reading. But this is a graphic that kind of illustrates, I think, some of the things we've been talking about, where it looks at, it has individual level, requirements, group level requirements, organization level requirements, and then community requirements. So you see at the individual level, you have public safety personnel, um, and members of the public, and then their interactions. So, you have members of the public and how their attitudes towards policing and past experiences and their social characteristics affect their level of interactions with public safety uh, personnel. So obviously, you know, since the murder of George Floyd, there's been uh, a lot of political and social issues surrounding the relationship between the public and police, particularly minority groups and police. So those things are going to come into play. So in an emergency kind of situation, the public is going to be dependent on the police to provide certain services, but the degree to which those services are going to be able to be performed well is going to depend on those interactions. And then if you go up to the organizational and group level, you have human capital issues and then other organizational factors. So from a human capital perspective, within organizations, you need people who are going to be functional psychologically. You're going to need good people in your organization. So you want to be careful as far as hiring people who are going to be able to perform well, including under stressful circumstances. You need to do a good job of training them. There needs to be a system of discipline and process for termination if people aren't working out, aren't performing well. Human resource policies so people understand what's expected of them, and obviously good quality leadership. Because even if you have people who are well trained and are well chosen, if they don't have good leadership, the organization's still going to struggle. And then in terms of other organizational factors, this was written during the COVID-19 pandemic, so they talk about response to COVID-19. But in our scenario, it could be a response to H5N1, or in a broader sense, it could be response to any sort of emergency or crisis like a wildfire or something like that. Access to resources, work group composition and similarity. So that, again, the ability of people to come together and work together, like in the Neil scenario, can professionals come together and support each other? Is the organization receiving adequate support, both internally and externally? Is the leadership providing adequate support? And is government and other partners in the private sector providing adequate support? Is there a good culture within the organization? So, going back to Goodsell, if you have a culture within the organization where people have developed this belief system that the work is serving a higher purpose, that should help to get you through a lot of these sort of situations. And is it a place where normally there are good working conditions? On a regular day, quote unquote, normal day, are there good working conditions? Because if the work conditions are challenging before a crisis, they're only going to get worse during the crisis. So all of those factors come into play. And then in terms of the community, national, and societal level, government and other stakeholders, different levels of government. Are they functional? Are they able to come together and come to solutions constructively? During COVID-19, even though there was a lot of partisanship and a lot of animosity within the government, there was still a capacity to come together to provide financial support and to agree on some policies regarding response to COVID-19. But if you have a situation where there's just a complete breakdown between the political parties, or a complete breakdown between the federal government and the state government and local governments, that's going to be a huge problem in a future emergency. Is there a good relationship between government and the non-governmental organizations, health and safety providers, insurance, first responders? So there needs to be good working relationships among all of these stakeholders that are going to be key to leading an emergency response. And then you get into the social factors, things like cultural trust or cultural mistrust, can obviously affect emergency responses. So in the wake of COVID, there's a lot of cultural mistrust toward public health and toward vaccines and things like that. That's going to, come into play. If there's a need to, like, at some point vaccinate for H5N1, people's skepticism toward vaccines is definitely going to come into play. Political climate, we talked about how that could affect the government, but in terms of, if people are very polarized politically, their ability to come together and help each other might be compromised. And then in terms of cultural values, the degree to which we prioritize helping each other as a culture could come into play. Historically, in times of crisis, Americans have tended to come together and do what's necessary to help each other, and we've seen that recently with the wildfires. But moving forward, will we continue to see that sort of culture of Americans helping Americans, people within the same state helping each other? And then system level factors, different types of policies regarding incarceration and immigration, economic policies, healthcare structure, community composition, education, income, and wealth groups, and then funding for public safety. So that kind of gets back to the idea that, when, there's an old saying, make hay when the sun shines. Which is the idea that we need to do what we can when things are good, because when the rain starts coming, it's going to be too late. So we have a tendency to get into an emergency situation. We do what's necessary to get out of it, and then we kind of mop the sweat off of our brow and kind of go back to things the way that they were, and kind of act like an emergency is not going to come again. But this indicates that we need to constantly be building back our systems and our infrastructure and everything to prepare for the next emergency. And that's something that historically the United States hasn't been all that effective in doing. Where if anything, we're fighting the last war, but we need to be prepared for the next emergency that could be coming down the road. So you also note in the diagram, there's the top-down effects and the bottom-up effects. So, we talked about the fact that, at an individual level, if there's individuals who are experiencing challenges, that is going to have repercussions for the wider community. And the same thing is true if you've got system-level factors, those are going to filter down, and if they're weaknesses, they're going to negatively affect individuals. And then all of this, all of these factors are going to affect public safety personnel performance, and it's going to affect whether people choose to withdraw. Public safety personnel can choose to leave the profession. We've seen people in public health choosing to leave the public health profession because of things that happened during COVID-19. You could have people leaving the community because they lose faith in the community. And then obviously, for people who stay in the community, it's going to affect their long-term well-being. So even if they make it through the immediate emergency, they still may have long-term negative consequences that they're facing. So to kind of try to bring everything together. So we've talked about accountability, we've talked about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, we've talked about resilience, both kind of individual and community resilience and organizational resilience. We've talked about different situations where that resilience is going to be tested, and tried to kind of, through this diagram, put everything together. But looking at it from the context of the H5N1 scenario, as you're looking at the discussion board and thinking about those issues that are posed there, thinking about how is accountability going to be enforced both internally and externally for the organization that you're managing. How are you going to keep your employees accountable? How are you going to remain accountable to the public? Thinking about, how are you going to protect people's physiological security needs, making sure that they're able to meet those basic requirements as best they can in order to remain functional. How can you as a manager sort of help to maintain resilience and sort of tap the resilience that is already present in the organization? Looking at the organization, would you consider your organization to be a high reliability organization? And if not, what are some of the weaknesses that your organization might have, similar to some of the weaknesses that we talked about in the context of 3 Mile Island or Chernobyl? And you're probably not going to be managing like a really technologically sophisticated organization in the way that those are, but trying to apply some of those weaknesses and the lessons from those weaknesses to this scenario. And then thinking about this graphic, which I think does a good job of kind of illustrating, how the connections between individual level, organizational level, and community resilience, and how those things affect each other from the top down and bottom up, and affect the outcomes. So in the context, again, of H5N1, what are individual level concerns that you're going to have to be cognizant of as a manager? What organizational concerns should you be particularly cognizant of, and what community and society level issues are going to affect your ability to respond as a manager? And again, thinking about it from the perspective of Goodsell's rubric, think about things from Goodsell's rubric that could be a strength for your organization. If you have a strong sense of mission, if you have a strong culture built on a belief system that'll keep people motivated, if you've got a system of communication where people can express themselves if they disagree with something, that could be a strength. If you're meeting a clear societal need and you can rally public support, that's going to be helpful. But also think about, what areas could you potentially be weak in? Because again, when we get to the end and have to do the SWOT analysis, you'll have to think about kind of what are the strengths of my organization in a situation like this, and what are the weaknesses in a situation like this. So I think we'll wrap it up there. So for next week, for Monday, complete the 4th PACBAC discussion. And then in week 5, we're going to be looking at McGregor's reading, the human side of the enterprise. That talks about theory X and theory Y for some of you who may have encountered that in the past. We're going to talk about some more readings related to COVID-19, telecommuting to telecommunity, which is relevant because it seems like there's a movement at the federal level and in some states as well to kind of do away with telework. So that'll be interesting to look at. And then looking at the Distazo reading on workload and how changing workloads can affect different types of employees differently. So we'll discuss those next week. In the meantime, if you have any questions, let me know. And thanks very much for watching.